Hello, everyone out there, and welcome to this week's installment of Tasting Together. My name is Pat Fahey. I'm a Master Cicerone and Content Director for the Cicerone Certification Program, and this week we're going to be talking about Belgian Triple. Oh my God. Anyways, so as I always start by saying, with Tasting Together, we like to get together and talk about some topic from the general canon of different beer topics. A lot of times we've talked about beer styles. Try to do it with a beer in hand. Hopefully you can drink along with me. Hopefully you have a triple, but if you don't, grab a beer anyway. You'll have a better time if you're having a beer while we talk through this. Last week, we talked about American barley wine, which was a lot of fun. If you missed that one, be sure to check it out. If you are new this week, one thing that I always like to say is be sure to ask questions as we go through. I won't necessarily get to your questions right away, but I have somebody who aggregates questions for me, and I'll do my best to make sure that I hit every question before we're done with the session. And, getting your questions answered, I think, really makes it a more enjoyable session for you guys, and honestly makes it more interesting for me. To talk quickly about upcoming sessions, let me look really quick here. So next week, October 21, we have Neil Whitty, and Neil is going to be doing American Lager. He selected American Lager, and I think he's excited to do that one. Not necessarily everyone's favorite go-to style, but honestly, it's a super interesting style. There's a lot of really great stuff to know about it between its history and how it's made. There's a lot to talk about there. I'm honestly a little bit jealous that Neil snatched that one up and I don't get to do it. Also, well, it's not my absolute favorite styles to crush. It is definitely up there in terms of extreme crushability. And then to pick an even more divisive style, on October 28th, I'm going to be talking about pumpkin beer. And I threw this one out kind of jokingly last week, and we had some people that were like, absolutely no, do not do that. And some people that were like, that's really exciting. If I'm being totally honest, pumpkin beers are not really a style that does it for me. It's not one of my favorites, though I have had some that I've enjoyed. But personally, I'm looking forward to, every week before I put these on, I get a chance to dig into the history of the style. And I've studied all of this stuff for years, I always learn new things every time I'm preparing for one of these. I've never dug really deep into the history of pumpkin spiced beers. So I'm looking forward to getting to dig into that myself and then getting to share what I find with you guys. So in honor of it being Halloween that week, well, it's not my number one choice to drink. I couldn't resist putting that on the list. And like Shayna just said, if you want to just come to that session and just hate on pumpkin beer the whole time, I'm fine with that too. That is totally acceptable. By the time we hit that session on October 28th, we'll have stuff lined up for the month of November. So look out for that then. We'll be announcing the lineup for that month at that point. Let me give myself one more little top up here. So, as mentioned, we're going to be talking about Belgian Triple this week. I am drinking Westmalle Triple, which is, you could say it's like the OG of the style. It's definitely one of my favorite examples of the style. If you guys haven't let me know already, and I've seen some people throwing things out in the comments, but if you haven't let us know, tell us what you're drinking. hopefully you were able to find a lovely and tasty example of the style. When it comes to glassware, tulips, those of you who have been here before know that like I usually default to this glass for just about everything. But in this case, it's actually one of the more appropriate options for the style. Most Belgian styles fit very well in a tulip-shaped glass. For monastic, for beers descended from monastic brewing tradition, like Belgian Triple is, a lot of breweries also will use like a chalice-shaped glass, so one that is also stemmed but a little bit more open at the top, to serve this style of beer. Westmahl's sort of branded glassware is a chalice. It's a beautiful glass. I don't have any here, unfortunately, but it is a lovely glass. So chalice is another excellent option for serving this style of beer. I will say, and like at this point, like the idea of being out at a bar that's like being out at a bar in Belgium serving Trappist beer in proper glassware, it feels like a different lifetime, but there's still something so special about that experience of enjoying the beer properly presented in appropriate glassware. It's, you know, it's just, it seems like a small touch, but it really does make a difference. So let's talk first a little bit about the history of the triple style. And like I mentioned, triple is considered to be a monastic style. It's descended from Trappist brewing traditions. And I know we've talked about Trappist brewing a few times, but I think we talked about it in video we did on Double and definitely the video I did on Orval. But in case you missed those ones, just to quickly recap, Trappist is not a style of beer. It is a protected designation for certain breweries and their products. And specifically, the stipulations that those breweries have to meet, there are three main criteria. The first one is that the brewery itself must be located within the confines of a Trappist monastery. Trappist is a specific religious order. It's a subset of the Cistercian order, I believe. Second one is that monks either have to be involved in the brewing process or have to somehow oversee the brewing process. Number of decades ago, probably would have been mostly monks involved in making the beer. At this point, a lot of Trappist breweries use secular employees to make the beer, and monks just oversee the process. But monks do still have to be involved in some way. And then the third stipulation is that the proceeds from these beers are meant to support the monastery and not to be sort of a profit-making venture. Once they use the money that they receive from the beer to support upkeep of the monastery, and any additional money beyond that point is typically donated into the surrounding community, since it is still very much of a religious order. So that's kind of Trappist in a nutshell. For a long period of time, there were only 6 or 7 Trappist breweries in the world. Now there are 12 or 13, depending upon how you want to count. There's one in France that there's one in France that at least historically their beer was produced for them by Chimay. So they were allowed to sell it, and they are a Trappist monastery themselves, but it didn't carry the mark on the label. Let's see. This little authentic Trappist product thing that hopefully you can read backwards. And then it seems like in recent years they've maybe built a brewery, but it's kind of hard to tell. The monks haven't kept us up to date. Their website isn't as great as it could potentially be. So hard to say, but 12 or 13 breweries total. There are maybe 170, 180 Trappist monasteries in the world. 12 or 13 of them have breweries. And Westmahl is one of them. Westmahl is actually the oldest one of them. Their brewery was founded, I think, in 1836. So that's about Trappist stuff. To talk a little bit about the triple style itself. It's believed that the first version of this beer was produced at a brewery called the Drielinden Brewery by a man named Hendrik Verlinden in 1932. So not actually that long ago. I know when I was originally learning about beer, I'd read about these monastic styles, and you have images of monks making beer. To me, it always seemed like, oh, these are styles that have been, passed down generation upon generation, made for hundreds and hundreds of years. I know it surprised me when I first found out that, like, oh, Belgian Triple is not even 100 years old. So first version was made at Drielinden. This guy, Hendrik Verlinden, was also a brewery consultant. And a couple of years later, he consulted at Westmalle to help them produce their version of the beer. So 1934, Westmalle produces a beer. They call it Super Beer, which is an awesome name for a beer. And that is considered to be the first Trappist rendition of the Belgian Triple style. A lot of people point to Westmalle Triple as sort of the standard bearer and the first, or at least one of the first versions of the style. Fast forwarding a couple decades, one of the brothers at Westmalle, did I write his name down? Brother Thomas. He also played an influential role in shaping some of the brewery's beers. And in the 1950s, he adjusted the recipe slightly. He made it a little bit more hoppy. And at that point in 1956, the name was changed to Triple and has stood since then. And at least as far as most historical accounts show, like, Brother Thomas made some adjustments to the recipes of the beers produced by Westmalle. The beers have more or less remained the same since that point. So for almost 70 years now. After production of that beer, we saw several other monasteries start to make examples of this style. At this point, most of what people call like the original Trappist monasteries are sort of the core 7 or so that have been around for the longest. Most of them produce a triple. Off the top of my head, obviously Westmalle, Chimay also makes one. La Trappe in the Netherlands makes one. Rochefort does not. Westvleteren, I don't think I wouldn't consider their blonde to be a triple. Acho, maybe one of their blonde beers could be considered a triple, but those 3 in particular, Westmalle, Chimay, and La Trappe, are probably 3 of the core Trappist triples that exist today. However, we've also seen a number of non-Trappist breweries produce this style. We've talked a little bit in the past about how, in addition to the Trappist monasteries making beer in Belgium, there are also a number of sort of abbey breweries, which usually will have some sort of allusion to monastic or religious themes in their work, but are not necessarily directly associated with a monastery or people practicing religion. In some cases, it's just a tool that's used for marketing. But a lot of those types of breweries also produce triple style beer. Think of like St. Bernardus or Affligem or Triple Carmelite made by Bastiles. All of these breweries are secular breweries that are still producing beer in this style. And then, of course, at this point in time, there are a number of breweries in the US that also make triple style beer. So, well, somebody said that Rochefort launched a triple this year. That is fascinating. Rochefort, for those of you that don't know, has traditionally had 3 beers, the 6, 8, and the 10. All of them are dark. 6 is a double, 8 and 10 are Belgian dark strongs. All of them are phenomenal beers. I would be very interested to try a triple from Rochefort, so I will look out for that. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the way that triple is made. Triple on the malt or fermentable side is super straightforward. It's just going to be Pilsner malt and some sort of pale brewing sugar, usually like a Belgian candy sugar. And I am sure that we've talked about this a lot of times, but once again, if there's anybody who hasn't seen us talk about sugar use in brewing, when brewers use sugar to make beer, outside of lactose, which is unfermentable by yeast, brewers use sugar to boost alcohol content while basically reducing malt flavor, reducing body, reducing residual sweetness in the finished beer. The reason it works that way is that when brewers use malt to make beer, the yeast ferment out a lot of the simple malt sugars, but you do get other things left behind, like some longer chain sugars, proteins, other various structural components of the malt that give the beer some amount of sweetness and some amount of body. When brewers add sugar to a beer prior to fermentation, the yeast is going to ferment through basically all of that sugar. So really all it does is it boosts the alcohol content and doesn't really leave anything else behind. So the result of that is you get a beer that is, say, this is a beer that's 9.5% alcohol. If this was made as an all malt beer, it would be super full in body. It would have a lot more residual sweetness to it. Because they use sugar as a significant portion of the fermentables, usually as much as 25%, they're able to produce a beer that's almost 10% alcohol, but is still pretty light bodied, and that ends up making it like very easy to drink. I'm sitting here and I'm just like, oh yeah, this goes down easy. And when we get done here, I'm going to stand up and be like, wow, I shouldn't have drank that triple so fast. So there you have it, sugar in beer. God, it's a lovely beer though. So like I said, very simple fermentable bill, Pilsner malt and sugar to thin it out. On the hop side of things, Belgian Triple is one of the few Belgian styles that usually features a significant amount of hops. Now, this is a significant amount of hops in like the European or Belgian sense of the word. Americans have a very skewed idea of what a lot of hops looks like because of the way that we use hops in beer to make things like IPAs. In a country like Belgium, a lot of their beers are not terribly highly hopped. And so Triple, this beer that is reasonably hopped in the total spectrum of hopping and pretty highly hopped in the spectrum of Belgian beers, stands out as being one that displays more notable hop bitterness and hop flavor and aroma. Brewers of Belgian Triple are usually going to default to continental European hops. Think like your standard noble hops, a lot of Czech Saaz and some traditional German noble varieties. And then also a variety called Styrian Goldings that comes from Slovenia is pretty commonly used in a lot of these Belgian styles of beer. For Westmalle specifically, I wasn't able to find the actual hops that were used in the beer, but I found multiple sources that said that they use 6 different hop varieties in producing this beer. So while the hops don't like jump out in the way that like a dry hop double IPA would hit you with hop flavor and aroma, there still is a notable hop presence. And because it's a blend of all of these different hops, it's not distinctly like one specific thing. It's just sort of generally herbal, floral, perfumey, continental European hop character. Let's see. And then yeast. Yeast is arguably the most important part of these beers. In a lot of cases, when you look at Belgian beer holistically, yeast tends to drive the vast majority of the characteristics of most Belgian styles of beer. And yeast flavor is definitely, I would say, the dominant aspect of this beer. It's still a relatively balanced beer between malt character, hop character, and yeast character, but yeast plays a really significant role in these beers. So brewers of these beers are going to use a very characterful yeast strain. The Westmalle strain is actually one of the, I don't know if I should say it's like the best known, but it's used at more breweries than just Westmalle. One of the things about different Trappist breweries is that over the years, because they're not really commercial enterprises, they don't view one another as like competing. They don't really compete with each other. They work together. And, if another Trappist brewery falls on hard times, the other members of the Trappist Association will help them out. So I know that in the past, Westmalle has provided their yeast to other breweries. And at a minimum, I believe Westvleteren and also Akel use the Westmalle yeast strain to make their beers. Now, the yeast character that you get in these beers can still differ somewhat significantly depending upon the fermentation conditions used. And one of the things that's pretty common in production of Belgian Triple is a lot of times brewers will use higher fermentation temperatures. Those higher fermentation temperatures will drive the yeast to produce greater amounts of flavor compounds such as esters, phenols, higher alcohols, etc. I know that Westmalle specifically doesn't really use higher fermentation temperatures. They usually stick to a more standard fermentation temperature of around 68 degrees Fahrenheit, which is around 20 degrees Celsius. But many other producers of triple will drive the temperature up in order to produce more fermentation character. A couple other notes about the recipe and the production. One thing that's worth mentioning is spicing or spiced character. In Belgium, brewers will sometimes add spices or other ingredients, usually in small amounts, usually just to add sort of a slight, but in some cases, unidentifiable additional flavor to the beer. I don't know if I've said this on here before, but it's a quote that I love, so I'll say it again. I remember reading somewhere that a Belgian brewer talked about using spices, or his philosophy behind using spices as, I want to add enough of the spice so that it changes the flavor of the beer, but not enough that you can actually identify what it is or what I added. So there are tons of Belgian beers out there that are not marked as having spices in them, but use low amounts of spice to augment the profile of the beer. That can definitely show up in Belgian triples. As far as I know, Westmalle does not use any spices in their triple, but triple Carmelite, I saw somebody ask a question about triple Carmelite. I'll look at the specific question a little bit later, but triple Carmelite, for example, uses a reasonable amount of coriander in that beer. It adds another dimension to the profile of the beer, but I would say it still fits nicely within the style of Belgian Triple. Then the last thing that I think is worth mentioning about production of Belgian Triple, and this holds true once again for most Belgian styles of beer, is that almost always this beer is going to be bottle conditioned, which means that it's going to be re-fermented with yeast in the bottle to produce the carbonation of the beer. In a lot of cases, Belgian beer is more highly carbonated than other styles of beer, and it can be easier to achieve that through bottle conditioning than through forced carbonation. And bottle conditioning is, there are people that will point to certain benefits of bottle conditioning, such as like a finer, tighter carbonation. I don't know for sure whether or not that's true. Anecdotally, I would say that, like, yes, in highly carbonated bottle conditioned beers, I feel like it does produce a sort of like a creamier texture of carbonation, but I can't point to anything like any hard and fast facts that would say that that is for sure the case. All right, so let's talk about the flavor profile of this beer. One thing that I mentioned earlier, and one thing that I really like about Belgian Triple is I feel like it pretty seamlessly, when it's done well, it pretty seamlessly weaves together malt characteristics, hop characteristics, and yeast characteristics to give you sort of one really well unified, well packaged flavor experience. I get kind of some like cereal grain, crackery, maybe lightly honey-like malt character on this. There's an herbal, floral, hop component to it as well. And then obviously various yeast esters and phenols. It's got there's a little bit of like banana character, a little bit of ripe pear, a touch of lemon peel, maybe faint black peppercorn. There's also a little bit of like perfumey alcohol character. There's a lot going on in this beer, but it's all really well integrated. It's, if I didn't sit here and pick it apart piece by piece, it's just like, this is a nice beer. Like, it's just a nice drinking experience. In addition to the aroma profile, there are some really important aspects of this beer that you get on the palate between the tastes and the mouthfeel. As with a lot of Belgian styles of beer, particularly these classic Trappist or Abbey styles of beer, it's very, very highly attenuated, which means there's very, very little residual sugar present. Well, it has some sort of fruity aromas. The sweetness level is very, very low. And this beer, like I mentioned, it's bittered a bit more highly than most other Belgian styles of beer. Between the higher level of bitterness and the very low body, very low level of residual sugar, it does have a pronounced level of bitterness to it. There's also several important mouthfeel traits going on here. The body of the beer is, I don't know, I'd say medium light, maybe medium. Carbonation is really high. It's a little bit lower now that it's like sat for half an hour and I've swirled a lot of the carbonation out of it. But, when this beer was poured, just explosive effervescent carbonation. And then the alcohol quality of it is also worth talking about. This is a beer that's almost 10% alcohol. In a lot of cases, it would be quite warming, sometimes even kind of like hot or even harsh. One of the things about well-made versions of this style is that it's definitely warming. Like, it has a warming quality to it when I swallow, but it's really smooth. It's really mild. It's really pleasant. It's, if you weren't paying attention for it, you might not notice it. And that kind of comes back to what I said at the outset. Like, they're deceptive and they're dangerously drinkable beers. It is very easy to sit down and drink a couple of these and not notice the effect that it is having on your cognitive abilities. Let's see. So let's talk about style comparisons really quick. And I saw somebody throw this one out, but I already had it lined up because it's such a tough comparison, and that's Belgian Triple versus Belgian Golden Strong Ale. So first of all, we don't put that comparison on exams because the two are so close. That comparison will never show up on a certified exam. It won't show up on an advanced exam. And, the master exam is open style discrimination. If we put a Belgian Golden Strong on and somebody identifies it as a Belgian Triple, they usually get most of the credit since there is so much overlap between the two. If you were to stack a Belgian Triple and a Belgian Golden Strong up side by side, Belgian Golden Strong is usually going to be a little bit paler in color, maybe a little bit more highly attenuated, so even more dry, even lighter in body compared with the Belgian Triple. And part of that comes down to the fact that Belgian Golden Strongs usually use an even higher percentage of sugar in the production of that beer. BJCP says that like triples usually have higher phenolics and lower esters compared with Belgian Golden Strong. In my experience, that doesn't necessarily hold true across the board. I've definitely had super estery Belgian triples, and I've had Belgian golden strongs that were a little bit more phenolic. So I would say the main things that I point to are the paler color and the lower residual sugar, lower body that you find in a Belgian golden strong. Another style worth talking about compared to a triple is a Belgian Blonde Ale. Belgian Blonde Ales are, of the sort of higher alcohol Belgian styles, not quite as highly attenuated. I always think of, they're certainly not sweet, but they're sweeter than you would expect to see a Belgian Triple be. And they're also usually a little bit lower in alcohol content. I think Belgian Blonde ranges from like 6 to 7.5 or 7.6% alcohol versus Triple, which I think is 7.5 to 9.5%. So your standard triple might be 2 percentage points higher than your Belgian Blonde. That's going to definitely impact the alcohol warmth that's present. And you also usually get more robust fermentation character out of a Belgian Triple than you see out of a Belgian Blonde. Last one that I wanted to have on here was Cezanne. And in all honesty, there's a lot of crossover between the flavor that you see in a Belgian Cezanne and a Belgian Triple. The main difference that I would point to, kind of similar to the Belgian Blonde, is the intensity aspect. The Belgian Triple, as a higher alcohol style, is going to have more notable warmth, is going to have overall a more intense fermentation flavor profile. A lot of traditional Belgian Cezannes are a little bit more restrained and are probably a little bit more highly attenuated than Belgian Triple might be. So that's those are some of the most closely related styles that I would compare to this. And last but not least, pairing with Belgian Triple. We talked last week about pairing with American barley wine, and I mentioned that like barley wine is not a great beer for pairing in a lot of cases because it's so big, so intense. In a lot of cases, it's best just enjoyed on its own. Belgian Triple is it's certainly big from an alcohol perspective, but because of the lighter body and because of the high carbonation and the pronounced level of bitterness, it has a lot to work with in a pairing context. Belgian Triples are really, really nice beers to pair with food. It's also, as I've discussed already, it's a very complex beer, which means it has a lot of different hooks to either complement or contrast various elements of different dishes. So when I think about pairing with Belgian Triple, I usually look first to the amount of cutting power that this beer has with its high carbonation and its moderate to moderately high level of bitterness. It doesn't necessarily have to be put up against something rich or fatty or something that it's going to be able to cut through, but I really think that that's where it works best. So I think of, rich dishes like fatty sausage, cassoulet, anything that's like a cheese-based dish. So whether that's like fondue or enchiladas or even like a quesadilla would be nice with this beer. Triple works well with a lot of different vegetables. It picks up really well on vegetal characteristics. Also works well in sort of matched up against herbal components. So if you've got something with like a chimichurri or a pesto or some other herb-driven sauce, Triple can work really nicely. Anything with basil, I think of certain Thai curries where you've got that like rich coconut character. That can work really well. Fried foods, fried fish, fried clams. A lot of Belgian beer is really, really well suited for pairing with food. And it's one of the reasons why Belgium has such a great tradition of matching beer and food with one another. So you really can't go wrong if you bought, if when you picked up your triple, you bought more than one of them, I'd encourage you to try the remainder with, try them with several different meals or try them with several different foods. And I think you'll find that you're able to make a lot of really nice matches between the triple and whatever it is that you're eating. So let me take a look at the questions. Let's see. Arturo asked or said, I get more bitterness from triple than double. At first, I took it as sour, but I believe it's bitterness. Is that typical? I'd say yes. It's probably not acidity. Sometimes there can be a little bit of a confusion between bitterness and acidity. And the thing that I usually tell tasters if they're trying to distinguish between the two is take a sip, swallow, and then wait. Pay attention to what happens. Acid tastes tend to have a strong attack up front and then fade over time, whereas bitterness tends to hit and then will usually increase for the first 15 to 30 seconds after you swallow. So, if you take a taste of it, you swallow, and you notice the sensation increasing, it's probably bitterness rather than acidity. In the case of triple versus double has pretty low bitterness. It has a little bit present to sort of balance the beer, but I can't think of a double that I've had where I was like, oh yeah, this has notable bitterness to it. Triple, on the other hand, usually does have a higher, more significant level of bitterness to it, particularly compared with Belgian double. Let's see. Michael asked about triple Carmelite, claims that tradition has a three grain ale with wheat, oats, and barley, still a triple. I would call triple Carmelite a triple. I know that they do have some stuff in like their labeling and marketing that's like made with 3 this and 3 that, and that makes it like, I didn't really address why it's called a triple, and in part that's because it's sort of lost to history. We don't exactly know. It's not like some people will say that it's 3 times the malt or the yeast. None of that is true. When you look at beers like double and triple and quadruple, there is no explicit like doubling or tripling or quadrupling of anything. They do get stronger in alcoholic strength as you go up that sort of ladder. But yeah, no, it's not explicitly triple anything else. And I would consider triple Carmelite to be a good example of the style. It's, like I said earlier, it is spiced with coriander, which it's probably spiced a little bit more highly than other examples are. It doesn't stick out, but it stands out. It's definitely a present and prominent component of the flavor profile of that beer. But outside of that, or even including that, it does fit within the general profile of what I would expect out of a Belgian triple. Got a question, is bubblegum an appropriate aroma in a triple? I smell it in Chimay, although BJCP doesn't say anything about it. When people get bubblegum aromas, I've talked with several like flavor experts, Bill Simpson from Araxa in particular, about bubblegum aroma and like where it comes from. And as far as I've been able to ascertain, I haven't been able to trace it down to like a single compound, but usually it's a combination of various esters and various phenolic compounds together in a mix when people perceive some sort of bubblegum aroma in beer. So even if it's not mentioned specifically in BJCP, this is definitely a style with high levels of esters, high levels of phenols. Bubblegum aromas totally within the realm of possibility in this sort of beer, absolutely. Let's see. Seeing spirited conversation about the Vanderbilt Act going on in the chat. I can't engage with whatever that is unless somebody asks a question directly to me, but that's rad. Oh man, Tom with the tough questions. Tom asked, which triple dominates the market in Belgium in the US? I don't know. I don't actually know. I would imagine, I especially don't know in Belgium. If I had to guess, it's probably either one of the bigger Trappist breweries or maybe Triple Carmelite. So either Westmalle or Chimay Triple or Triple Carmelite, if I had to guess. But I'm hearing that it's Chimay. That seems reasonable. They're one of the bigger producers of this style of beer. In the US, I'm not sure at this point. One of the better known American producers of Belgian Triple is Victory. Their beer Golden Monkey is a pretty prominent example of the style. I know that that's really widely available within the US. I also know that, I can't remember, I have a friend who used to work for Artisanal Imports, which is the company that works with Bastilles, brought in Triple Carmelite. And I know that at one point they were like far and away the largest triple, at least in the city of Chicago, if not further spread around the country. So I know that that is also a very prominent style here in the US, though that was several years ago, and the landscape for imports is very different now than it was then. So I'm not exactly sure. It's a good question, though. Let's see. Eric asked, when you refer to honey in the malt flavor in the malt profile, how do you differentiate that from the honey oxidation flavor, or do you think it is oxidation due to the time in bottle from exporting to US? It's probably a little bit of both. Honestly, there's a little bit of honey character in this beer. I'm trying to think back to the last time I had it in Belgium, which, like I said, now that travel is not really a thing, it's been a while. I would say that the honey that develops in it is probably attributable to oxidation. And that were the beer a bit fresher, it probably would have less of that characteristic. It probably would be more cleanly kind of like just grainy or cereal malt sorts of flavors. So yeah, I don't necessarily differentiate between that flavor and the flavor that you get from malt oxidation. I would imagine that it's probably a result of that. Let's see. Chris said, I'm sorry if I missed this, but can you talk about candy sugar in the triple as opposed to a double or a quad? I did not actually talk about that, unless you're thinking about when I most certainly talked about it when I talked about double, but I didn't talk about it today, so I'll touch on it briefly. All of those Belgian monastic styles, Belgian double, Belgian triple, and Belgian dark strong or Belgian quad, are going to be made with candy sugar, once again, to help thin out the body, boost the alcohol content while keeping the beer very, very dry and lighter in body. In the case of Belgian Triple, which is a pale beer, they're going to use a pale candy sugar, one that does not impart very much additional flavor, really just serves as a source of fermentables. With darker styles like Belgian Double and Belgian Dark Strong, the color of those styles usually comes from the sugar that is used. So they're usually using a dark candy sugar, which is caramelized in some way or cooked in some way to develop that dark color. And in the processing, or in the process of producing that sugar, it also develops flavors of molasses, brown sugar, dark and dried fruits like prune, plum, fig, those sorts of flavors. So they're very different ingredients in those different styles of beer. And well, in double and Belgian dark strong, they still do serve that purpose of thinning out the body and boosting the alcohol content. They also bring a lot of flavor and color to those beers. So yeah, great question. Very, very, it's a similar ingredient, but has very, very different effects on the beers that it's used in. Warsaw asked if the high ABV in Belgian beers came from their history of prohibition. And yes, to some extent. Early 90s, and somebody may have fully covered this in the chat, but I'll just quick riff off of what I can remember of the Vanderbilt Act. I believe it was early 1900s, and I believe it wasn't full-on prohibition, but it prohibited the sale of gin and spirits. So because there was sort of a vacuum of higher alcohol products, a lot of Belgian beers started to shift, or some Belgian beers were made to fill that space of higher alcohol products. And that is what led to some of these styles being formulated as higher alcohol beers. Shayna says 1919. Great. Thanks, Shayna. Let's see. And Frank asked a follow-up question on that. And I should have read more about the Vanderbilt Act before this talk, expecting that I would get a question so that I could answer it thoroughly. That's the gist of what I remember of it. There may be other pieces to it, but if you haven't read the Belgian Road to Cicerone book, that one's kind of top of mind, and I was flipping through it in prepping for this because it's one of the more recent Road to Cicerone books that we put out, and a lot of research went into that book. I know a couple things really shaped the way that Belgian beer is today. One of them was a series of sort of competitions designed in the very early 1900s, designed to encourage Belgian brewers to produce better beer. And then the Vanderbilt Act had the effect of driving alcohol content up for some producers of beer, at least. I know also that, as in many other places, competition from import beers, particularly pale lagers like Pilsner, helped to spur on the development of a lot of the pale styles of Belgian beers. I think early triple, it was sort of like people are drinking pale lagers. Well, we're going to make a pale beer that's still Belgian in character, still features kind of like Belgian yeast profile, but has that pale color, that really nice appearance that people are enjoying of these other beers. So let's see. Got a question on whether or not these beers age well. Is it recommended to store them? They age better than, a triple age is better than an IPA, but does it age well? I'm a pretty big proponent of drinking beer when it's fresh. I've talked about this a fair number of times on here, especially after having just lots and lots of beer die in my cellar. It's a very small proportion of beers, and this is my personal opinion, you may feel otherwise, but I think it's a pretty small proportion of beers that really change in a positive way as they age. Some beers certainly change in an interesting way, and you could make an argument of whether or not they're better fresh or better slightly aged. But most beer, I would say, is best when it's fresh. Belgian styles of beer like this, in part because of their higher alcohol content, and in part because in the US we're used to them already being a little bit old since they're imported, they hold up reasonably well over the course of maybe the first year of their life. I still think that they're better the fresher they are. It's not necessarily a beer that I would want to lay down. Of any of these Belgian styles that I would think about laying down, maybe like higher alcohol Belgian dark strongs. You think of things that start to get up in like the 10 to 12% alcohol range. Those beers have a lot of like dark fruit character and don't really have any hop character to speak of. And those dark fruit notes will tend to increase as the beer ages. So that's, for some people, that's a positive in aging those sorts of beers. I say all this with the caveat that, like, if you hold on to a triple for 2 years and you taste it, you're like, I like this way better, then that's great. You're like, nothing wrong with that at all. But I remember when I was a younger drinker, I definitely had the idea in my head that these beers held up really well at the time. You know, age them out for 2 years, no big deal. And I don't feel that way anymore. They still do hold up all right, but they're better. They're truer to what they're supposed to be when they're fresher. Let's see. Got a question. Other than Victory, what are other U.S. producers of Belgian Triple? Oh, man. The first one that always comes to mind for me is Allagash. I think Allagash is one of the best producers of Belgian styles of beer here in the U.S. I'm trying to think outside of them whose triples I really, really like. Shayna, help me out. I've been drinking triple for an hour. This is not the time to ask me questions that require me to access my memory. I'm trying to think of other American triples that I really like. A lot of the other ones that I can think of that I really enjoy are Belgian made. You know, I saw somebody throw out De Dola's Dolatev, which is a really nice beer. De Glazentoren makes one called, I think it's like Udneki. I can't remember the name of the De Glazentoren triple, but that's a super nice beer. I was wondering if Ommegang made a triple. When I think of their Belgian styles, the ones that really come to mind are like their Hennepin Cezanne and their Abbey, which is a double, and then their Three Philosophers, which is a Belgian dark strong. I couldn't think of their triple. But yeah, Russian River, if you can find it. Russian River does a phenomenal job with their Belgian styles of beer. So that's one that I would definitely look out for. Yeah, Ommegang doesn't brew a triple anymore. Lost Abbey, similarly, like Shayna mentioned, like they do great Belgian beers. Off the top of my head, I can't think of whether or not they have a triple in their lineup. So yeah, there aren't a ton of American producers of it that come to mind, and I'm sure I'm leaving some out, and I'm gonna like look up as soon as we're done with this and be like, oh my God, that one, and be embarrassed. But yeah, like I said, I would say the two that come to mind in the US are Victories and Allagash. And then there are a lot of examples from different Belgian breweries. Yeah, I was going to say Boulevard had Long Strange triple, but I don't know if they make it anymore. New Belgium makes a triple. Their triple is pretty nice. So yeah, there are some in the US. I'll usually default to a Belgian example if I can, and oftentimes you can get your hands on a Belgian example, but there are some nice examples of them being made in the US. So, and I believe that covers all of the questions. Let's see. Frank asked a quick one on chronological order for Belgian beer styles. If I covered everything, that could be a lot. The two that I'll talk about briefly are double and triple. As far as I know, one of the first doubles that's recorded being brewed is from Westmalle, and that was in the 1920s. And then triple followed about a decade after that. I'm not sure where Belgian Dark Strong fell in the mix of that. And then if you want to talk about the other various Belgian brewing traditions, those are all over the board. So, oh, Fin de Monde is not a, somebody mentioned Fin de Monde. Fin de Monde from Unibrew is a really awesome example of a Belgian triple. It's not a US triple, but it is American. It's from Canada. So that's another great example of a Belgian triple. All right, folks. Thanks everybody for stopping by. I encourage you, pick out your favorite American lager for next week. I'm going to be here drinking Coors Banquet, watching Niels talk about American lagers, and then I've got to do some homework to find out what pumpkin beer I am going to bring to the table in 2 weeks. I hope to see all you guys then, and stay well until then. Cheers.